Who remembers being taught at school, embryonic recapitulation, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? Do you remember that? Well, let me put it another way. How many of you remember being taught that when an embryo develops in its mother's womb, it goes through a fish stage with gill slits till it becomes human? Who remembers being taught that? Oh, okay. Who remembers seeing pictures like this in their textbook? Remember those embryo pictures? And you look at them and say, oh, look how similar they are. You know, here we have these different animals here, and we have man, and look how similar the embryos are. Did you know that those pictures are still in most public school textbooks in America and other parts of the world today? And yet the man who popularized this, called Ernst Haeckel, who wrote this book called The History of Creationism, doctored his diagram. It's a well-known fraud. A doctor in England, not that long ago, in fact, did some work, and he showed that arrow there points to Haeckel's original diagrams, and so he went and looked at the actual embryos themselves, and when you look at them, here's what they look like. The fraud, it was absolutely startling. What Haeckel did, and admitted he did, he used the same basic wood carving diagrams of the embryos because he wanted to believe in evolution. He believed it was true. And the public was sucked in. What gets me is this has been known to be a fraud for 40, 50 years or more. It's still in most public school textbooks. It's incredible. Well, Haeckel published a book called The History of Creation. Here are some of the statements from Haeckel's book. I hate to even read these to you. I'm sorry to read these to you. I'm embarrassed to read these to you. But I want you to know what people were learning in colleges and universities across America and other parts of the world. Imagine generations in America learning this. At the lowest stage of human mental development, the Australian Aborigines, Polynesians, and so on, the Negro, and it's very, very sad what they were learning there. And then we go on to some of the other statements that he has. I consider the Negro to be a lower species of man, cannot make up my mind to look upon him as a man and a brother, for the gorilla would have to be admitted into the family, according to some English traveller he quoted in that particular book. Or here we have, he has an account of a missionary, Morlang, who supposedly tried to, without success, to civilize the ape-like Negro tribes. They stand far below unreasoning animals. Can you imagine generations of students in America learning that sort of thing? Isn't that mind-blowing? Now, here's an interesting quote. I want you to look at this. Do you know where this quote comes from? It comes from the biology textbook used by John Scopes and others at the time of the Scopes trial. Now, evolutionists don't often tell you about this, but here is the textbook that was teaching evolution and so on in the public schools at that time, the very one that John Scopes purportedly used. And it said this: there are 5 races or varieties of man. There's the Negro type, brown race, American Indian, Mongolian or yellow race. And then I want you to have a look at this last statement here, because this is very, very telling, this last statement here. And finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. You imagine whole generations coming through a public education system in America from the public schools, learning that those who are Americans, the Caucasians and Americans, were part of the highest race of all. What do you think that would do in regard to their views on others? Pretty sad, isn't it? You know, I'm going to challenge us here. I'm going to say this. I believe the church should get rid of the term races. You see, at the time of Thomas Jefferson, for instance, when people talked about races, by and large it was the English race, the Irish race, that sort of thing. But evolution, Darwinian evolution, has so permeated our thinking that today so many people, when you think of races, tend to think of inferior and superior races, some that are lower than others. And friends, I believe all of us even have been indoctrinated in some way in regard to that sort of teaching. People before us aren't as good as us and things like that. I think it's about time the church abandoned the term races and started to use terms like people groups or something like that. And we should be out there telling the world there is only one race anyway. We're all descendants of Adam. Remember a man who told me after listening to one of these lectures, he said, when I went home and filled out my census form, he said, when it said, what race are you, I put down Adams. And I thought to myself, can you imagine some federal government public servant looking at that census form and saying, hey, has anybody heard of this Adams race? Well, of course, a long time ago, everyone heard of Adams race, didn't they? You know the sad thing to me? The church is not leading the way in regard to the issues of racism because, just like it did with the millions of years, it also adopted the secular worldview into the Bible, and now, because it's politically incorrect to talk about some of these things the way that they have been, now the world is changing their mind and the church is left behind because it accommodated to the world in the first place. You see, that's what's happened over and over again in the church. On the ABC News Science page, in regard to some of the research that had been done on humans, they said this: more and more scientists find the differences that set us apart are cultural, not racial. Some even say the word race should be abandoned because it's meaningless. Why hasn't the church been out there saying this? Why haven't we been leading the way? But no, we're infiltrated by outside ideas. That's the problem. In fact, that's why I like the term in Acts chapter 17, God made of one blood. We're all related. We all go back to Adam and Eve. And that's why when I look at any one of you here, you know, I've tried to train myself, and you'll see as we go through this in a moment, not to look at little minor external features, but to program myself to start looking at who the real person is, not just some external feature that some people have been taught to look at more than others, and we'll talk about that. You see, how many of you were taught, like I was taught, that there are main racial groups, like we read in that particular quote from the textbook in the Scopes trial days? You know, they're Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, Australoid. How many were taught those sorts of groupings? Do you realize, in a sense, how racist they are? I mean, have you ever thought, why do they put people into those sort of groups? Why are the Australian Aborigines out on their own, for instance? Why do they do that? Well, here's something that's very interesting. I want to go through and look at what researchers today are finding. For instance, Dr. Venter, part of the Human Genome Project, as they were putting together this draft of the human genome, you know the Human Genome Project, the entire sequence of the human genome, do you know what they found? Startling conclusion. You know what their conclusion is? There is only one race, the human race. Wow! We finally figured it out. Of course, if we'd have read the Bible, we would have known this all along. But now scientists are starting to say, so you know what the church does now? Well, I guess if the scientists are saying it now, oh boy, now we can start to believe the Bible. Wow. You know, it's sad, but that's how much of the church operates. It is sad, isn't it? It's interesting. Every human being carries about 6 billion base pairs, the chemical rungs of the DNA ladder, in the nuclei of his or her cells. Did you know that our personal DNA code differs from that of a random stranger by 2 rungs for every 1,000, or about 0.2% of the whole? In other words, the difference genetically between any 2 people is about 0.2%. Now, I want you to think about that. In other words, the difference between me and one of you here is about 0.2% genetically. Here's what scientists have also found. In the field of genetics, this is from some research that scientists have been doing, researchers have concluded that the genetic differences between the so-called races, we'll come back to that a little later on, account for only 0.012% of human biological variation. That's pretty insignificant. That's only 6% of the 0.2%. That's pretty insignificant, isn't it? In other words, as the Human Genome people found out, they said if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, do you see what they're saying? The basis by which we talk about race is external appearance. And let's be honest. Let me ask you a question. I want you to be honest with me. In America today, when it comes to issues of race and prejudice, tell me something. Would you agree with me? The major issue, if we're really honest with ourselves, the major issue is not the shape of your ear or your chin or your nose, it's how much skin color you have. Am I all right? Pretty sad. Now, what I'm saying to you is this. If you use those classifications, Caucasoid, Negroid, and so on, I do that just for the sake of this argument here, the difference between any 2 people is about 0.2%, but the genetic differences that are used for the so-called racial characteristics, in other words, skin color, eye shape, and so on, constitute only about 0.01%. That's pretty insignificant, isn't it? You know what the Human Genome people said? The criteria people use for race are based entirely on external features we are, what's that word? Programmed to recognize. You know what, friends? I was shocked when I came to America. I have to tell you, I was shocked when I came to America as an Australian. See, I grew up in the church where we have Australian Aborigines in our churches, and some of the New Guinea native people, that have come to Australia and so on, and people from, the Philippines and other sort of places, and I never thought a thing about it. I come to America, and I was shocked because I found a lot of places in America, there is segregation on the basis of what people call skin color. And it still exists today, doesn't it? In a lot of places in America. I mean, that shocked me. I thought, what is going on? This nation's supposed to be the greatest Christian nation on earth. What's going on in America? It's one of the reasons why I had a real burden to get that book out, One Blood, and to talk on this particular topic. Because I would like to suggest to you that in this country, as well as other countries, there's racist attitudes for all sorts of reasons, but I think in this country, one of the greatest characteristics used for racism is skin color. And notice what the Human Genome people said, we're programmed to recognize. I suggest to you generations of children who are brought up even in church homes, programmed to look at skin color. That if you weren't brought up that way, you wouldn't see the differences as many people see them. See, think about this. I mean, do you belong to a church where when people walk in, you say, uh-oh, they're the little earlobe people. Little earlobe people aren't allowed in this church. They've got to go down the road. This is only the big earlobe people church. We should segregate on earlobes. We don't do that. Why not? What's the difference between big earlobes, little earlobes, and the shape of your eye and how much skin color you have? They're all just surface differences that are very minor. But you see, we've been programmed to select certain characteristics. And it engenders racism and prejudice. But people say to me, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Look at all those people. Look how different they are. Look at the different colors. Excuse me? Actually, I don't see much difference at all. Why not? See, people say to me, but you're a white person. I'm not white. Look, there I am pictured with a white background. If I looked white, I'd be dead. And somebody says, well, there's a black person. Actually, they're not black. Did you know there are no black people and no white people? See, we all have a pigment called melanin. Melanin is a brown pigment. There's actually a couple of forms of melanin. Actually, if you're a redhead, my mother's a redhead. If you're a redhead, you have one of those forms that really is missing, and that creates a problem because you can get skin cancer because of ultraviolet radiation and so on. And so, I mean, redheads are like poodles, well, anyway, I can say that. My mother's a redhead, all right. But you know what I'm saying. But you see, actually, my mother has skin cancers cut out almost every year, even if she doesn't go out in the sun, because she needs that pigment that she really doesn't have, okay? But you have a pigment called melanin. In other words, it's there for a very important reason. It's sort of a complicated factor. The melanin is formed as little umbrella over your dividing cells, and it's how much is broken down and so on. But again, let's look at just basic principles. Probably 6 genes or more for the amount of melanin in your skin. But if you have big A, big B, it means lots of melanin, little a, little b, a little bit of melanin. So if you had all big A's, big B's, you could be dark, little A's, little B's light, a mixture, you'd be in the middle. By the way, what do you think Adam and Eve most likely were? In the middle genetically, right? Middle brown. You see, if they were what we call Caucasian white today, then all their children would be little A's, little B's, right? That'd be a boring world, wouldn't it? We'd all look the same. But if they were all big A's, big B's, they'd all be black, or what you call black, which is not really black, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But if they were a mixture, if they were in the middle brown, the majority of the world's population are middle brown, by the way, then you realize their children could have been light through to dark in one generation. Lots of families like that. In fact, they're exciting families. What's the next one going to be like? They really are exciting families. By the way, there were twins born in England a number of years ago, one dark, one light, and some people actually did not believe that they could have the same parents and so on, and there was a lot of prejudice involved, as from what I've read in the newspapers. But you see, if you understand some basic genetics, you can understand how that could happen. I was at one seminar, a guy came up to me and said, were they identical twins? Anyway, let's go on here. So then people say to me, okay, but how come some people only produce dark-skinned people, some only produce light-skinned people? By the way, I hope you understand something. When people say, what color skin are you? That's the wrong question. It's what shade of skin are you? Because we all have the same color. It's a brown pigment. You can have light brown, dark brown, you can be in the middle. So, when people say to me, oh, there's a colored person, I'm a colored person. That's true. See, we all have the same basic color. It's just a matter of how much or how little of that color you have. Then people say, why is it some people only produce dark people, some people only produce light people? Well, think of the event of the Tower of Babel once again, okay? Now, again, just doing basic principles, all right? If you start with big A, big B, little b, Adam and Eve being middle brown, mixture like that, here are all the possible combinations. Now, think about this. If, for whatever reason, because of the Tower of Babel, certain people ended up in a certain area with only big A's and big B's, all the others died out of the population, like the long-haired dog example and the short-haired dog example, Well, if you've only got big A's and big B's, you're only going to produce what? Dark-skinned people. Imagine some others go to a different climate somewhere, and imagine, for instance, in Queensland, the highest rate of skin cancer in the world, where I come from. Well, you can imagine, before the days of all the skin lotions and understanding more about skin cancer and so on, those with dark skin in that environment would survive better than light skin, and maybe the opposite in some other environment. You see what can happen? Just like with dogs, right? And so you could end up with a group of people only with little a's and little b's that only produce light-skinned people. The big A's and big B's would have to mix with the little a's and little b's to get back all that genetic variability that was separated out because of the Tower of Babel. Very easy to understand. Hey, you could even theoretically, in a sense, get things like this. You imagine that some group of people had to run from another group who continually warred upon them or something like that, and had to run from wild animals. Maybe the selection process there would be those with the genes for the best athletic ability survive better than others. Maybe they today give some of the world's best athletes. And the same could happen even with intelligence or any other characteristic. Just because somebody might be more intelligent than others, or somebody might be a better athlete than others, or do something else better than others, doesn't mean you look down on them in any way whatsoever. If you have the biblical worldview, we're all equal before God and all go back to Adam. Trouble is, some people look down on others because there might be some differences or whatever. We've inherited all these genes going back to Adam and Eve. It's very important to understand we're all of one blood. Even when it comes to eye shape, it's not a matter of different eyes. You have the same eye. Just you have genes for the amount of melanin. You have genes for the amount of fat in your eyelid that might give it the almond shape. And again, a sorting out process because of the Tower of Babel, but they're really the same eyes. As one researcher said, a man called Day, he said, it's kind of like all of us are recipes. We have the same ingredients, maybe in different amounts, no matter what kind of cake we turn out to be. And you know what? I sort of like to picture this for you because I like to picture things in diagrams. How does the average American bake a cake these days? Well, you buy a box and mix it up with water. But you imagine baking a cake, and you can make a number of different cakes, slight variations, but the same basic recipe. Well, in a sense, Adam and Eve start out with the same basic original DNA recipe. We're all the same basic recipe. We just have very slight variations. Wow, what a difference it makes when you understand things correctly. But let me ask you all a question. Put your hands up if you've heard of, doesn't mean you believe it or anything, but you've heard of the so-called curse of Ham. For that, my name is Ham, and so I'm very, very sensitive to that. But hey, you know something? When I ask these questions, and then the next one I'm going to ask as well, the biggest response I get to these questions is in America, compared to any other country in the world. It's interesting.